Nice. Hello, Eastern. My name is Don Skaddis. I'm Director of Communications for the Airline Pilots Association. I'm here at the Hyatt Regency Hotel in Washington, D.C., where we're in the midst of an executive board meeting that was called to discuss the current situation at Eastern. We have prepared this videotape, and you will see on it a speech that Captain Jack BAVIS just concluded for the executive board. And I'll sit down with Jack and we'll take on some of the tough questions and answers. And then Captain Henry Duffy, President of the Airline Pilots Association, will conclude the tape with the actions taken at this executive board. With that, key it up, let's get right to Jack BAVIS' speech.
Mr. President, national officers, members of the Executive Committee, fellow delegates, and friends. Henry asked that I give you an update as to what's taking place at Eastern, so I'll try to do that, and I'll break it down into various components for you. We first talk about what's going on in the bankruptcy process. Today, there's supposed to be a hearing under Section 1113. That's the section we were able to get into the new bankruptcy law, which precluded a management just from unilaterally, arbitrarily abrogating contract. That was a success that we were able to do in changing the bankruptcy code to put that provision in it. Eastern filed to abrogate and reject the contract. In that filing, they sought to achieve in their contract bargaining all the things of which they were trying to bargain with us over the past year or so we've said no to. The statute provides that if the union stonewalls, quote stonewalls, and fails to bargain in good faith, that the court would unilaterally reject the contract and put into place the last offer that's on the table. We have been meeting under the auspices of the court and at their direction. We have been ordered to do that. We've been locked up for weekends, for nights, for days, for the past 2.5 weeks, and we're scheduled to go back into a closed session in Miami starting Friday for as long as it takes. It's my best belief that the date of the hearing has now been moved from the 13th to the 1st of August. There has been some minor progress in that discussion. Progress in the sense that we've been able to show the court, the examiner, that what the company is demanding from us in their contract proposal is beyond that which is necessary to make Eastern a surviving carrier, even under the company's business plan, which of course we reject, which calls for downsized Eastern Airlines, most of it to be hubbed out of Atlanta, and selling off some of the substantial routes and equipment from an airline that originally had something like 285 airplanes to a company's projected plan of 157 airplanes. If one included the midway sale, you would have to reduce that 157 by 16. If that also involved the 20 or the 15 757s originally predicated to be sold to U.S. Air. My best understanding at the moment is U.S. Air has said that it's going to not purchase those 757s. Midway deal, however, is still there. So potentially, the fleet of Eastern airplanes could be down below 140 airplanes if all the transactions that Eastern is predicate to sell actually takes place. On August 1st, then, we're going to be in the court, arguing to the court as to why the company's economic proposal is beyond that which they need necessary to operate even their scaled-down operation. We think we have a decent chance in that. We've used all the experts, including the ones from ALPA, the staff, Randy, and others in a round-the-clock effort to show that what is being asked for is beyond that which is necessary. Remember the date, August 1st. Between now and then, management has asked for and has received an extension of the period of exclusivity of 120 days. That period of exclusivity runs out on the 21st of this month. The net effect of that period, those of you who've been in bankruptcy, which is not a pleasant place to be, understand that nobody else can make a business proposal until such time as the debtor in possession, Mr. Lorenzo, his period of exclusivity runs out. So between now and the 21st of the month, the only plan that can be considered is his plan. He's dangerously close to having his plan approved by the court and by the creditors committee. It's our understanding that his plan of reorganization will hit the floor between now and the 21st, but probably no later than the 21st of this month. While all that's going on, And it's also our understanding that he's going to get approval from the creditors committee, and most likely by the court, if there is not another plan in front of him other than Lorenzo's plan. We have been struggling with outside purchases of the airline for some time, 2.5, almost 3 years since I first took over office. We've come close a couple of times. We are still in there in that fight. We have an outside investment firm headed up by Shearson Lehman, a person by the name of Joe Ritchie. His plan is a substantially better plan, economically and otherwise, than is the Lorenzo plan. It does not involve selling of the Miami hub South American routes, the Caribbean, to American Airlines, as is the Lorenzo plan predicated to do. He is trying to find a way to get some congressional pressure along with us and ALPA so that the court must look at this plan in a realistic way and give it a fair chance of survival. In their own view, if the creditors committee and the court approves the Lorenzo plan between now and the 21st, the chance of anybody else overcoming that in the bankruptcy process is negligible, impossible in their terms. So our struggle, amongst others, is between now and the 21st to produce that new proposal, to get it on the table, to get some pressures put on internally through the legislative arm, the executive arm, and through everything we can do in terms of AFL-CIO, to get that plan realistically looked at and get it a chance for survival. That plan requires raising of capital, some $200 million worth of outside financing. Shearson would say to us that the only way that could be raised is through non-conventional means, that because of the history and what's going on at Eastern, that it is impossible to raise that money from outside sources. And so we have moved, in concert with Henry, internally to the AFL-CIO to get them to try to raise $200 million by pledging pension assets from various pension plans out there, which is the hub core that would allow this particular Ritchie deal to move forward. We met with them yesterday. They're trying to do that. Time is short. We've got, like I said, to the 21st, assuming that the Lorenzo plan gets put on the table. If it does not get put on the table until sometime after that date, then of course we have additional time to try to get that particular deal put into place. Short of all of those two solutions, one of which is a court-imposed contract, which still doesn't resolve the strike issue, because the strike issue is a separate issue from the 1113 process. We still have the questions of picket lines. We still have the questions of back to work. It's an issue that none of us even want to talk about or allude to, and it's the first time we've even used that word publicly to say back to work, because that means going back to work for Frank Lorenzo. And I have to tell you that that is the last thing that the Eastern pilots even want to consider. The other alternative is, without a sale, is to stay in the fight. Since the beginning of the strike, there's something like 285 Eastern pilots have gone to work. Most of them, 225 of them, went to work within the first few days of the strike. We started with 3,400. Really not sure what the number is now. We showed 2,800 active on the list and voting membership. I know that several hundred have applications at most every airline that I'm looking at out here that is here on the floor. Some of them are in school, and as they get to school, and we find out about that, just so you feel better about that, and you know it, we shut off the strike benefits, so there isn't anybody who's double dipping in this game, so as we know that. Eastern pilots also understand the fragility of everything that I'm discussing with you here today. Now, part of our planning process, while we go down these three tracks, which was the buyout track, and finding a way to secure the airline if possible, and continuing to fight so as to provide the job security. One of the things that we did and counted upon was the fact that ALPA said to us, if this airline fragments, if it breaks apart in the course of the strike, you can count on us. So Eastern pilots out there believe that this organization, when the parts of this airline break up, which they are doing as a course of this bankruptcy process, that the rest of ALPA would open up their arms and that they would find a home, that they would justify, that then would justify, partly justify, the reasons why this pilot group went out on strike in the first place. And that is to try to defeat the guy that's trying to defeat us, that is Frank Lorenzo. Now, we've been doing that for over 130 days. Our people are still fighting. They do not wish to give up. We're not going to walk away from the fight. If you hear dying gasps for breath every once in a while, that's because we're frustrated. Because we look at the fact that the federal government has turned its back on the Eastern pilots and this situation. I mean, we're not so naive to believe that Mr. Bush should be looking just what's going on here at Eastern. We kind of believe, though, that he should give it as equal priority as he does to what's taking place in Poland, that he should understand that what's happening in this country to the workers over here, particularly in this industry, should get at least equal weight, that what we're doing is fighting an oppressive management, which in fact is what Mr. Walesa is doing over there in Poland. Now, I've been around a long time here at ALPA, and I've said to you before on other occasions that the problem we got is 40-some-odd individual airlines going their own individual way. And I've said to you that we're not going to make it that way, that sooner or later you're going to have to come to a point in time where you can no longer just say, thank God that's not me, go home, handle your problems, whether those are mergers or negotiations or organizing, do all of that on your own, and somebody else is going to take care of the problem. As you hear this breath of ALPA and of Eastern saying, guys, you've said you were going to protect us, and you are not protecting us. Guys, replacement airplanes, if we get airplanes and a replacement for our existing fleet, we don't want Eastern pilots to go with that. Or that we question the fact that if airplanes leave because our airline is buying airplanes, and after all, this is what's happened before in this industry, and pilots have never gone, that therefore we shouldn't take Eastern pilots with that equipment. Or that ALPA merger policy has never been interpreted, or this situation has never come up before. That may be accurate and that may be true. But there are 3,300 pilots out there who are saying to themselves, we did all this on the belief that our brother pilots were going to be supportive. And that conscience question, as you hear that death rattle of Eastern pilots, listen a little bit louder. Because if that happens, you're hearing the final death cry of ALPA. Thank you.
Well, I think that presentation clearly speaks for itself. Now let's go to Captain BAVIS. Jack, we've got a couple questions. Let's see if we can get some answers to them. Let's start with the Ritchie situation. Where is it? What's going on?
Don, for the past couple of weeks, we've been working very closely with Mr. Ritchie, with his financial advisors from Shearson, Lehman, the advisors for ALPA, Mr. Farrell Cooper-Smith and Bruce Simon of Cohen, Weiss and Simon. What we've been trying to do is assist in the drafting of Mr. Ritchie's final proposal so as to make it more acceptable to the courts and to the creditors and hopefully to Mr. Lorenzo. In fact, there was a meeting yesterday. I cannot talk about the specifics of his proposal because, of course, everybody would like to know that until such time as Mr. Ritchie is ready to present his proposal to the creditors committee and the court. But I will talk about it in general terms. First, he's proposing to buy all of Eastern Airlines with the assets that it has today. He's proposing to maintain Miami as a hub, along with the Caribbean and along with the South American routes. That proposal would employ something upwards of 20,000 to 22,000 Eastern employees. In contrast to the Lorenzo plan, which only provides jobs at the moment for some 17,000 employees. Clearly the difference in that is a difference that all the employees hold near and dear to their hearts. Besides the question of employment, is also is the retention of the Miami hub system. Now, in order to make Mr. Ritchie's proposal a reality, he has to come up with some financing for his plan. Shearson Lehman has been working on coming up with a plan that would produce over $200 million worth of additional financing for Eastern Airlines. We've also been meeting with the AFL-CIO. In fact, yesterday we had a meeting with several of their chief executives looking at the question of having some union funds, some union-sponsored pension plans, guaranteeing a note for an employee ESOP of upwards of $200 million so as to make that part of this package proposal which would go to the creditors committee and the court. We literally are in a countdown. Mr. Ritchie is, we are, the bankruptcy court is, and so isn't the AFL-CIO. Hopefully, we'll be able to put those pieces together in a very immediate time future. There is a deadline date that we're operating under with the court. On the 21st of this month is the end of the exclusivity period for Mr. Lorenzo. Until that time happens, nobody else can make a proposal that the court can seriously consider. which means we have to get somebody's attention, either Mr. Lorenzo's attention or the creditors committee and or the court's attention for that proposal. There was a series of hearings, as you know, took place in Washington, D.C. in front of Congressman Oberstar, which Mr. Ritchie presented quite eloquently, his proposal to buy Eastern, portraying himself as a person who's a people person, which is the big issue that's been wrong with Eastern Airlines for some period of time. Hopefully that congressional pressure, mixed with some determinations out of the Department of Transportation, Mr. Skinner, Secretary Skinner, that says that international routes just should not be indiscriminately traded, that the government has a role in that, will give everybody time to pause and reconsider the fact that there is an alternative to a Lorenzo plan, which we see as a two-step liquidation process. Now, we believe that the Ritchie plan, properly presented, showing that there is equity and that there is full restoration for the creditors committee, will create allies out of them. And we hope that this government pressure, the congressional hearings, and oversight to the court will get the court to rethink and relook at the Ritchie proposal as a viable deal. The 21st is a real day. We know that Mr. Lorenzo is close to developing and getting approval for his own plan of reorganization. We assume that on the 21st or shortly before, he will be filing such a plan with the creditors committee and ultimately with the court. If in fact that plan is approved by the bankruptcy court and approved by the creditors committee, it will make any purchase of Eastern Airlines other than the Lorenzo type plan very difficult to achieve. We literally would have to have Lorenzo's approval or have the court voting down that the plan of reorganization Mr. Lorenzo is putting forward is not a viable plan. We, of course, are prepared to argue that question in the courts when we get to it. But that means that there is a time limit between now and the 21st in order for the financing and the plan to be finalized by Mr. Ritchie. We're doing everything we can to do that. We would hope that the executive branch, that President Bush would understand that the workers in America have as difficult problem of negotiating with oppressive managements as does the citizens and Mr. Lech Walesa of Poland. We would hope that some kind of way Mr. Bush would reach within himself to also express the view that the plan of deregulation is not working, that the way Lorenzo proposes to do it is going to mean less competition and a destruction of a once proud airline and a major competitor in the business called Eastern Airlines.
Jack, you alluded to it in your first answer, the bankruptcy court. Give us a status of exactly what's going on up in the bankruptcy court.
Don, there have been several proposed asset transfers and sales. It is rumored that South America is in Eastern is in negotiations with another airline. We believe it to be American Airlines for the purchase of the Miami hub, Caribbean, and South American routes. That has not yet come forward to the table. The next major asset issue deals with Midway Airlines, where some 16 DC-9s, along with the Philadelphia hub, is presently under consideration. There is no docketed date yet for that particular transaction to come forward. Clearly, the Ritchie plan, which calls for approximately 200 some odd airplanes, anticipates that those airplanes that are going to Midway would remain with Eastern Airlines, so that if additional large assets sales took place and was approved by the court, whether that's South America or the Midway sales, that creates a problem for us in terms of maintaining what we look at as the critical mass of Eastern Airlines. And that is no airline that we know about has been able to shrink itself to profitability. Granted, Eastern can sell a lot of the assets and accumulate a lot of cash, but it still needs mass in order to be able to compete in this marketplace as a standalone Eastern. That's our concern. We would hope that those issues, that the Ritchie plan will get addressed prior to the time of any future asset sales. And again, we see that deadline to be this month.
Jack, with regard to the bankruptcy court, it's my understanding that the company has now filed under a Section 1113 to abrogate the pilot agreements. And under that section, you are now in negotiations with the company. Could you give us the status of that?
Well, it's not fair to characterize it as negotiations. First of all, we're going down two tracks. We recently filed for mediation under the Section 6 process so as to separate out from the bankruptcy court process actual bargaining with Mr. Lorenzo over contract terms. The court has ordered us to participate with Mr. Shapiro and the company under what they call Section 1113. The last time bankruptcy took place in the history of aviation was with Mr. Lorenzo. And as a result of that, we were able to get legislation which put a new clause in the code, now called Section 1113, which preempts management from unilaterally abrogating a contract unless they bargain with the individuals, unless there is a hearing in the court. By the company making application to reject our contract, they started a process which involved a third party for the first time, called a court. The court's determination of the statute must be to look at what is fair and equitable, not only in terms of labor management issues, or in this case the pilots versus the company, but is what the company is asking for from the pilot group in its 1113 filing, fair and equitable to all the other parties involved. For example, it is not fair and equitable to assume that if it is just the pilots who are taking a haircut in this transaction, that is appropriate or fair and equitable. The creditors committee, the debt equity holder, Mr. Lorenzo, is not putting anything more into this transaction. Besides the question of the creditors committee comes the other employee groups. Comes the question of the secured creditors. I mean, what kind of guarantees does the court have to say that what management is asking for from the pilot group under 1113 is fair and equitable? We've been participating in that process by direction of the court for over 2 weeks. We have made some progress in that, in the sense that we've been able to show that what the company is asking for from the pilot group is over and above what they need to get, including to make their business plan, which we believe is a flawed business plan. Their business plan, of course, only calls for something like 1,700 to 1,800 Eastern pilots. We're not in agreement with that business proposal. We think it's far short. We think the company has understated its numbers, and what they're asking for from the pilot group is excessive in numbers, even according to their own business plan. Our experts, our lawyers, Farrell Cooper Smith, in concert with the management, in concert with the examiner and his experts, is looking very closely at what the company's proposal is. And as I said, I believe there's some progress been made in a sense that we've been able to refute some of the company's demands that they've been making upon us in that sense. Now, there was supposed to have been a hearing on the 13th that dealt with the question of 1113. That date has been extended now to August 1st. So we're going to be continuing in this 1113 process under the auspices of the court so as to show good faith bargaining. There's one other part of that statute which I'd like to mention. It's a part of the statute which says that the parties must bargain in good faith, that the parties cannot stonewall, so that if Eastern just said this is the way it's going to be, that could be considered to be stonewalling. If the union said that it's not going to participate, that is another definition of stonewalling. If that took place, when the hearing comes about now on the 1st of August, we'd be standing in front of the court. If we were the ones being accused of stonewalling, the court would then look at that, make a determination, probably upon the recommendation of Mr. Shapiro, the examiner. The company could then institute their last proposal on the table. And if one assumed that that proposal was more onerous than even what their own business plan, you can see that the net effect would be to the pilot group, even assuming that we're coming back to work under Mr. Lorenzo, that that contract could be that much worse. And in fact, if the court approves that, and we're still looking at Mr. Ritchie trying to purchase the airline, we now have to climb out from underneath the bankruptcy courts approving, abrogating our contract and reinstating something in its place. By the way, that's not a temporary process. The bankruptcy could go on. We could be in bankruptcy for 2 or 3 more months, even assuming a plan of reorganization was approved. Doesn't mean that when that's over, we revert back to our original contract. The court is perfectly capable of extending that contract term throughout the business life of the plan of reorganization by the company, which could be 2 years or 3 years at length. So clearly, non-participation in the process put us at serious risk. Therefore, we've been meeting with the company and Mr. Shapiro round the clock, if you will, in direct processes with him and with the examiner. The IM and the TWU attended meetings Monday and Tuesday of this week. Friday of this week, they've called all the parties into a general session at a location in Florida to get under 1113 to have discussions with all the parties, meaning all the unions, management, and the court, trying to find what Mr. Shapiro would characterize as a consensual type of an agreement. All of that's going on, while at the same time Mr. Ritchie is trying to get his deal approved through the creditors process and through the courts. And again, I'd point out to you the deadline date of the 21st, which is the end of the exclusivity period, and finally the hearing on 1113, which is August 1.
Jack, you also mentioned earlier that parts of Eastern could be sold, and that we could see some assets, like we already have, that have moved to other carriers. This executive board is addressing that issue of Eastern pilots moving with the equipment. You've just come up from the floor. Where does the debate stand right now?
They haven't decided yet, Don. As you know, the meeting's going to go on for another day or so. The first transfer of asset, of large pieces of assets of Eastern, is the lease of 14 727s to Pan Am. We also understand Eastern and Pan Am are presently negotiating for additional asset sales, including some A300s. In anticipation of this problem, last March, we brought to the Executive Board the question of ALPA merger policy, how it would apply after Eastern had applied for bankruptcy, for example, to make sure that if assets get sold off in this bankruptcy process, that the rest of ALPA would uphold a policy which says that Eastern Pilots should have the right to go under ALPA merger policy along with those assets that get sold. In this case, we have Pan Am. Pan Am pilots at the moment questioning whether or not that ALPA merger policy applies to a lease. Bear in mind now, this is the first time in ALPA's history that that particular clause of merger policy under fragmentation has ever been called into question. This is a new policy. It hasn't been invoked before. It hasn't been put into place before. The Executive Board will come to the determination, we believe, that this does fall under ALPA merger policy, and we will then get on with the process of negotiations, mediation, and finally arbitration over how many pilots, for how long, what qualifications they have should go to Pan Am either temporarily or permanently under the ALPA merger policy. There's a couple of other airlines that are involved at the moment, at least one, that's Midway. There's a proposed sale of assets from Philadelphia, including some 17, I believe, DC-9 31s. Midway MEC has said that they would take the pilots. Midway management has said they don't want to take the pilots. That issue has not yet come in front of the court, so it hasn't finally been determined. At the point in time that the bankruptcy court would approve that sale, we'd be doing the same thing on the Midway transaction to invoke the merger policy so that Eastern Pilots would have the right to bid to go to Midway under the ALPA merger policy, which essentially means the two pilot groups try to resolve how they would do it by direct negotiations, mediation, or arbitration. And that's the status of it today.
Jack, a little bit about the strike in general. Where does it stand?
Over 130 days into the strike, Don, the Eastern Pilots are conducting themselves in heroic fashion, beyond that which had anybody ever believed that we would be able to do. We've had only a few people who have crossed the line, if you will, after the initial days when the 200-some-odd, 225 originally crossed. Management's plan cannot work without pilots. Mr. Lorenzo's plan cannot work without Eastern Pilots. His reorganization plan is predicated upon getting enough people to fly his operation. He's closing down the training school, or at least portions of it. He's using instructors on the line. He's importing Continental pilots and training instructors to train Eastern Pilots. He can't get these people out of the school fast enough. His plan is not functioning properly. He is behind in terms of what he needs in order to get the approval of the bankruptcy court. He's losing lots of money every day. The strike, in that respect, has been a Mexican standoff between him and between us. And it is that strength of that pilot group out there that is determined in this, not just to run up a white flag and not just to surrender. We came into this, Don, in the beginning on the concept that we were supporting a legal strike by the IAM. And we were in sympathy with the IAM because the company wasn't giving us any choice. Our assets were being taken away. Our money was being upstreamed. There were management fees and fuel charges and things like that, including a soda reservation system, which was far undervalued for the price Lorenzo gave. I mean, we struck this airline because of the IAM, in sympathy with them, and because we saw that the company wasn't giving us any choice for any future or any long-term survival for Eastern Pilots. Whether or not it is the Ritchie plan, which we all dearly want to get done, whether or not it's the 1113 process that's presently being conducted in the bankruptcy court, whether or not it is just that we continue to struggle, that we demonstrate more, that we protest every place we can, to the federal government, to the White House, through internally to ALPA, the one thing that gets us home, the one thing that preserves the right that I started a long time ago, which said all of us, all the pilots, or none of the pilots, that's the only thing that's going to get us home. So that if our people lose faith because it's been 130 days and they're tired and it's economically hard on them, if they splinter, if they break, if they go back to work under these conditions today, unless we do that as a group, to whatever solution it is that we're going to finally find, he will have won. He cannot win as long as we maintain our solidarity and our unity with each other.
Jack, you mentioned all of us or none of us. Even the Ritchie proposal calls for a scaled-down operation and not as many pilots. How do you plan to accomplish this?
Don, the major objective of any union is to preserve jobs and to provide jobs for all those Eastern pilots out there who wish them. Part of what we're doing here at this executive board is that if assets get sold, that Eastern pilots go with them. That will provide jobs for some of the Eastern pilots, including under the Ritchie plan, which could contemplate fewer people coming back. There are contractual things that a union can do in order to provide jobs for everybody. That includes things such as early retirements, buying people into early retirements. That includes leaves of absence. That includes job opportunities with other assets that take place. And that includes job sharing, so that instead of flying an 84-hour month, we take a less of a guarantee and provide jobs for everybody. Now, those kind of concepts have always been used in the industry. When an airline's been shut down, like this one has for the amount of time it has, it takes a period of time to regenerate the traffic flow and to get everybody back. There are things that we can do on the training side of it so as to preclude some of the cost impact that would take place under the Ritchie plan, so as to have people to come back to work, and to operate the airline by having perhaps reduced pay to be there on the property as we bring everybody back so everybody can get on benefits and things like that. It is in the context of revising work rules and schedules and things like that, that ALPA has it throughout its history when they've had strikes like this, been able to provide jobs for everybody to come back. That's what I mean by all of us and none of us done.
Jack, it has never ceased to amaze me over the last couple of years the Eastern pilots always have many irons in the fire regarding this situation. But the Eastern pilots need a message. They need a message today, a short-term message. What is the Master Chairman's message to the pilots?
First, I have to say to them that I haven't been on a video to them or publicly to them for a while. They should understand the reason for that is because on the 1113 process, we have a blackout on us, so that we're not supposed to be talking about the details of what's taking place behind those closed doors. By the same token, what takes place internally to the creditors committee is also wrapped in secrecy, so that if we talked about that publicly, we then run the risk of getting ourselves thrown off the creditors committee. Clearly, we don't want to signal to management the directions and the moves that we're making. And as soon as I start talking about it publicly, management immediately goes to plan its next course of action. My short-term message to the Eastern pilots is, we are in 130 days plus of a strike. I'm asking you to hold on and to hold tight and not to give up. Remember that the reason we took the strike on in the first place was for one reason, and it's called long-term job security. I can't get you there with all the help, with all the experts, with all the committees, with the strike committee, with the negotiating, with everybody else, if the Eastern pilots break. Give me the chance to see whether or not we can get this one home. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you very much, Jack, and good luck to you and to the Eastern pilots.
We've just completed a special executive board on the Eastern strike. One of the important issues that I brought to this executive board and for these master chairmen to consider was their continued support for you Eastern strikers. I'm happy to report to you that we have a unanimous resolution reaffirming our support for the Eastern strike. I wish you could have been here to listen to the commentary and the debate from these master chairmen, because there's a great deal of pride and support for everything that you've done over these last 4 months. One of the important issues that we brought to the board was how ALPA merger policy applies to the transfer of assets as certain assets are disposed of through the bankruptcy process. Specifically before the board was the Pan American transaction concerning 14 Boeing 727s. The board strongly endorsed merger policy's application. They directed the president to appoint a facilitator to expeditiously deal with this issue, I'm going to begin working on that tomorrow morning. I think we will have a facilitator in place before the end of this week, and joint meetings between the Eastern merger representatives and the Pan American representatives should begin very expeditiously. Of equal importance is that ALPA merger policy was specifically defined to apply to any future asset transfers that we're likely to encounter from the bankruptcy court. I know that's of a great deal of importance to you. As you know, we've spent a lot of time trying to stop these asset transfers in the bankruptcy court. We'll continue to do that, but those assets that are disposed of, we're going to make every effort to be sure that Eastern pilots go with them. I want to give you my personal pledge of continued support. You have the respect and pride of the 42 airlines that ALPA represents and the 41,000 pilots.